In this section of the course, we're going to learn about test-driven development. First, we're going to cover testing in Django. So when you test in Django, Django has something called the Django test framework, which is built into Django and comes out of the box. This is what we're going to be using to write the unit tests in this course. The Django test framework is built on top of the unit test library. The unit test library comes out of the box with Python, but the Django test framework adds some additional features to this library that's useful when you're testing Django projects. Some of these additional features include things like the test client, which is a dummy web browser that you can use to make requests to your project. It also allows you to simulate authentication, so you can handle authentication by overriding it for your unit tests, which is useful when you're writing tests because you don't always want to have to handle the login and registration process for your test. The Django test framework also comes with database integration. It automatically creates a temporary database for you, and then it will automatically clear the data from that database once you finish running each test. On top of Django, we have the Django REST framework, which also adds some additional testing features, specifically useful for testing REST APIs. The main one that we'll be using is the API test client, which is just like the test client that Django provides, except it's specifically used for testing API requests. So where do you put tests in your Django project? When you create a new app in Django, it automatically adds a test.py module, which is a placeholder where you can add tests. Alternatively, you can create a tests subdirectory inside your app, which allows you to split your tests up into multiple different modules. It's important to remember that you can only use either the test.py module or the test directory. You can't use them both, and if you do create tests inside your test directory, you need to make sure that each module is prefixed by the test underscore. Also make sure that when you have tests inside a directory, you have the init.py file added to that test directory, because this is what allows Django to pick up the tests in the test runner. Here's an example of a project. Here we have app 1, where we have the test.py module that we're using to store the tests. And then under that we have app 2, and in that example we have the tests subdirectory, and we've broken our test modules down into two separate modules, one called test module 1 and the other called test module 2. Notice that we have the init.py file inside this tests subdirectory, and also we have prefixed each of our test modules with test underscore. Next, we're going to talk about the test database. So it's often useful to be able to test code that reads and writes data to a database. And the problem you often have is that you want to have a separate database for your tests compared to your actual application, because you don't want to be creating test data inside the real database. So Django will actually automatically create a specific database just for your tests. And it does this automatically. And the way it works is you run the test, and then it will clear any data that was created by the test, and then you run the next test. So every test that you run inside the Django test framework will have a fresh database to use. This happens for every single test individually by default. However, you can override this behavior, although you don't do it very often. It is possible to override the behavior so that you have consistent data for all of your tests. However, it's not really recommended unless there's a specific reason to do that, because it's ideal to have a clean data set for every test that you run. There are various different test classes provided by the Django test framework. One is called simple test case, and this doesn't contain any database integration. This is useful if you want to test code that doesn't need the database. And the benefit of using this is that you can save some time when you're executing your tests, because you don't need to clear the database and set up the database for every test that you run. Then you have the test case class, which is the most common class that you'll be using. And this is when you do require database integration for your test. And it's useful when you need to test code that needs to write or read data to your database. In our app, this is going to be the one that we use in the most cases. Here's an example of some test code. So when you're writing your test inside your test module, the first thing you want to do is import either simple test case or test case, depending on which one you want to use. In this particular example, we don't need database integration, so we're going to use simple test case. Then you import the actual code that you want to test. So this could be a module, or it could be a specific function or a specific class. Whatever it is that you want to test in your test case, you need to import it at the top of the test module. Next, you define your test class. So here we have a test class called viewsTests, and we're basing it from the simple test case. It's very important that you base it from either the simple test case or the test case base class, because this is how it's picked up by the Django test runner. Then you define your test method. Each test that you want to add to your class needs to be added as a separate method, and these methods will all be run by the test runner when you run your test suite. It's important to make sure that you prefix the name of these methods by test if you want them to be picked up by the test runner. So here we have an example, test make list unique. So this is going to test a piece of code that takes a list and makes the values unique. So what we're doing here is we're first setting up the inputs. So this is the setup phase of the test, and this is when you create any variables or data that you need in order to test the actual piece of code. So here we're just creating a simple list with some duplicate items that we can test gets made into a list of unique items after we run the test code. Then we actually execute the code. So here we're calling the remove duplicates function that we want to actually test in this test case. We're going to assign the response of that to res, short for response or result, and you can call this variable whatever you want. I like to kind of standardize it, and I usually use the res as a short for result or response, and this just is my preference. You can obviously call your response objects whatever you want when you're writing your code. Then you have the assertions. So this is what checks that the code did what it was expected to do. So in this particular case, we're checking that the response is equal to the list of unique items that we define. So in the inputs, we had sample items, which had duplicates for 1, 2, and 5. And we just want to make sure that the list that was returned is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's no duplicates in the list. So if this equals true, then the test will pass. However, if the response is not equal to this list, then the test will fail, and you'll get some information on the screen about what was different. So now I'm going to show you how you can actually run tests with Django. So you can do it using the Django CLI. The first thing you do is type python manage.py and then test, and then you hit enter, and this will go ahead and run the test suite. So you can see here that we have ran 2 tests and they all passed and we got the response okay. So that's an overview of using the Django test framework and how you would write unit tests for a Django project. Now let's move on to the next lesson.